this brings back a lot of memories. This is a photo that my wife Beth took of us, of me and Jim, when I was here interviewing him about 42 years ago. And it was in the front room just as you come in, used to be his living room, and that's us. And it was always the big fireplace in the back and the big bookshelf with all his amazing books that he had inside us. So, as Jim said, I'm a Waterloo native. I literally grew up 6 miles from here in Waterloo, but I never heard of James Hurst until I went off to college on the East Coast. And a classmate of mine said one day, "Do you know James Hurst?" And I said, "No, I don't. I never heard of James Hurst." He said, "Well, he's from Iowa, and he's a former poet and a friend of Robert Frost." And I said, "Well, I never heard." So I looked into it, and fast forward a few years, I'm on the faculty in the English department at Iowa State University, and I decided to try to meet Hurst and interview him with the idea of publishing some scholarly articles. And so Jim was very gracious, and Laurel, his wife, very gracious, and invited me into their home. I was here for at least 10 different interviews, and also Fern Noon and Paul Engel, who were Hearst's literary colleagues at the time, they were still living, and I was able to interview them as well for the book and some other people. Meanwhile, I also did a lot of original research. Hearst's papers are at here, University of Northern Iowa, in the special collections, and I went through those. And there was also some of his letters and manuscripts collected at other university libraries across the country that I was able to access at the time, and so do my own original research. And so I completed the process, and I did publish a couple of articles on Hearst and his poetry at the time, but I got the idea that I think it deserved a book. Because if he had never written a single word of poetry, his life story in itself was compelling and very inspiring to me, with all the challenges that he faced and how he dealt with all that. So I decided to write the book. As Jim said, it came out about the same time that Hearst's own autobiography came out. And even though the publisher that I approached at the time said he liked it, it would be perceived as duplicating Hearst's own work, which it doesn't. But that was the judgment of the publisher at the time. So now we leave Wisconsin. We leave Iowa and go to Wisconsin and end up in Madison. And over all these years, I've changed careers and I became an accountant. So from English professor to accountant is a natural transition. So I ended up as an accountant and worked as a professional accountant for several years before retiring from full-time work about 5 years ago. Through all those years, I took the manuscript with me wherever we moved. It was in a little box that, just got moved around, moved everything else. And periodically I would send it out to somebody I thought might be interested in publishing it or would know who would be interested in publishing it, because I felt it was good. And I felt the story was compelling and Jim's poetry worthy of attention. And so periodically send it out. No, we're not interested. No, we don't do biographies. Who's James Hurst? We never heard of him, etc., etc. So finally around last Christmas, I sent the manuscript to Scott Kowalty, who is the editor of Jim's book of complete poetry that you can get from University of Iowa Press now. And Scott apparently sat down and read it through the same day I sent it to him, because that night he sent me back an email and said, "I really like this. Can we get it published? Why isn't it published?" And involved some of his colleagues and eventually Jim, and who was prevailed upon to publish it through his Final Thursday Press, for which I'm very grateful. So here I am after about 40 years or so as an overnight success. So what I want to read today is a section of the book that deals with the premature death of Jim Jim's first wife, Carmelita. And I was just speaking to somebody, to Sherry, before the talk now, and she said, well, I never knew about his first wife. But that was an important part of the story. He married late in life, and she passed away prematurely and before the age of 50. Actually, she wasn't even 50 years old. So I want to talk about that and read about that and how he reacted to that, and then how he met Merle, and who became his second wife, and eventually, well, he went through a rough stretch with his writing, but eventually, after he and Merle found each other, he was able to start writing and come up with some very, very impressive poetry indeed. So I will read from the book. So I don't see anybody following along in the book, but this is the end of chapter 4. On October 9th, 1951, Carmelita Coldwoodhurst, not yet 50, died at Sears Sartori Hospital. If I could love you for a year or 5 years and then die, she had written to Hurst just before consenting to marry him, it would be open field and clear run. But life, as you and I have observed, does strange things to the most steadfast. You and I, Jim, are too erratic and too sensitive for time to leave us as we are today. The proof of these words, now that the long ordeal was over, was almost too much for Hurst to bear. Housekeeper days. Whatever else Hurst had lacked in the first 50 years of his life, physical health and strength or self-confidence, he had been blessed with the closeness of family. But in those 50 years, parents, aunts and uncles, and a brother had died. His sister and nearly all his cousins had moved away. He had left his other brother on the farm. Now his wife was gone. He was physically and spiritually alone. This loneliness was a kind of poverty he was not used to. The quietness with which I watch you go deceives myself. The fact is past belief that I cannot, by calling on your name, hear your light step and feel your hand touch mine. Sunflowers touched by frost shake out their seeds and wither in bright creeks the wild blue flags. And I, spendthrift of love beyond my means, find myself beggared in an empty house. After Carmelita's death, Hurst hired a series of housekeepers. The young son of one of them turned out to be the only bright spot in Hurst's daily routine. The boy gave Hurst his one chance to help raise a child, and the two of them enjoyed a close relationship. Hurst could usually stay a step ahead of the boy. Once when the boy threw a violent tantrum that his mother couldn't stop, Hurst came out of his study, waving his arms and bellowing. The boy looked perplexed and said, Jim, you better get back to work. The boy went on playing quietly. Hurst spent a brief stint at the hospital in Iowa City for the exhaustion that had come on during the last few months of Carmelita's illness. Here, away from their home and its memories, Hurst began to hatch ideas for a total escape from his past. He later said that thoughts of suicide crossed his mind, but there is no evidence that these thoughts were more than passing impulses felt in his gloomiest moments. Rather, as he had first turned to writing, partly to find escape from his earlier misfortunes, he now turned his thinking to other pursuits that might help him forget. He told friends he was going to leave teaching and run a motel, or a chicken farm, or a gas station. He made plans for extensive travel. He tried to convince himself that because he was unable to write, he neither needed nor wanted to again. After his return to Cedar Falls, however, he stayed with the farm and his classes, holding on to what remained of his earlier life. His popularity as an instructor continued to rise as a result of his considerate approach to teaching and his no-nonsense approach to writing. Probably few of his students realized how much they did for him, as well as how much he did for them during those years. Autumn Love. The last, longest, most successful, and most satisfying phase of Hurst's life and writing career had begun, though he had not known it, shortly before Carmelita's death. Merle Norton, Carmelita's best friend and roommate from nursing school, had taken a leave from her job in Moline, Illinois, to come to Cedar Falls and help care for her friend. A year and a half later, she made a return trip to Iowa and came to Cedar Falls to check on Hurst. She found him still in mourning and talking about leaving everything for some new venture. Her sympathetic and sensible nature saw the need for a steady influence to help Hurst get back into harmony with the realities of his life. She urged him to continue his farming and teaching. She encouraged him to go ahead and take a long vacation, after which he could return to his work with a fresh perspective. She also suggested that he try writing again. Merle's presence made Hurst feel a warmth and hopefulness that he hadn't experienced for years. She, who had always liked Hurst and admired his talents, found herself caring very much that he'd be happy. They soon knew they were in love. After she returned to her post with the Public Health Department in Bremerton, Washington, she received by mail his proposal of marriage. She immediately accepted. They set the date for December 5th, 1953. In Change Toward Certainty, one of the best poems Hurst would write about Merle's role in his life, Hurst uses the day when the coming of spring is first noticed on the farm as the symbolic background against which to highlight Merle's influence. The afternoon closed in until it seemed no larger than a room with snow and cloud. I met you there among the apple trees, close to the feedlot, where the playful steers rumpled the bedding in their narrow pen. Oh, we were all prisoners of the day, though some found fences more substantial than the feeling. I was centered in my mood. Your warm, appraising look slid off my back. Look, and you pointed to a maple tree where swollen buds now showed a waxy red. I looked from her bare ground to find the frayed snow carpet. Then you said there's not much yet. I looked at you and saw your hair curl lively from your scarf, framing your face where the excitement grew out of an anxious frown, as if a light had come to light blind eyes. Your mittened hand turned snug in mine like a child's, while a shadow went away from your face, and the actual bodies of things filled up the space where their shadows it seemed to be. Nothing seemed changed, and yet the change was there, and I felt your love beat in me like a pulse I had always known. Second bloom. With the proper setting in which Hurst could again find the concentration and motivation to write, it was just a matter of time before he'd be writing as much and as well as ever. Hurst had always felt that acceptance by the editors of Poetry magazine meant measuring up to the highest standards. Between July of 1956 and October of 1957, he wrote to Poetry magazine almost once a month. You mustn't let me impose on you. In my efforts to work back again to satisfactory verse making, you are the folk I measure achievement by. If you can't use what I send you, don't mind returning it. As always, I'm grateful for your trouble. Here are a few more pieces I wish you would examine. It has always seemed to me that there should be a place for farm poetry, the real thing. It is bound to be plain, naive, somewhat didactic. I make my living farming along with a little school teaching, and I have something to say. But the expression may be faulty. I will appreciate your time if you will look at these verses. Finally, the poem's success was accepted. A first-rate example of the way Hurst's mature style can combine a strong sense of form with the impression of spontaneous speech or reflection. When I come home from work at close of day, lying with the sunset, faced with the evening chores, the hungry pigs, the unmilked cows, the hens restless for my attention, with feed and hay to measure and lift, it seems the whole outdoors will let its need for order rest on me. I hear the windmill's voice as I clean pins, but never the meadowlarks, a warning sign I've meant to heed, but never do. Now I'm old and stooped, I've come to see that life's a mortgage no one can renew, that each year charges interest for its use. I found I traded even farm for sweat, to justify the boast I'm master yet. Shaky and cold under the winds of use, I read on the tax receipts, the land is mine. In his renewed poetry, Hurst mastered a cynicism that searches oneself for the causes of one's inevitable disappointments. Meanwhile, Hearst also pursued other more general markets for his verse. His poems appeared in several major newspapers, the Chicago Tribune, the Kansas City Star, the Denver Post, and the New York Herald Tribune. Popular magazines such as Saturday Evening Post and Ladies' Home Journal used his verse. Educational journals such as The Instructor and the Iowa English Yearbook featured his poems, as did publications by various religious groups, Chicago Jewish Forum and American Friends magazine, for example. It may be argued that Hearst's verse was seen by a wider audience than that of any other writer also appearing in Poetry magazine. Hearst always aimed to write poems that would delight the average reader, as well as satisfying the sophisticated. He once wrote to the poet Carl Shapiro, whom he had come to know in the late 1940s when Shapiro was editing Poetry magazine. My things are simple and obvious, and usually a metaphor for something else. Hearst published 47 poems, or nearly one a month, between June 1957 and December 1962. This was more new poems than he had published in the decade before his second marriage. But this was just the start. In the 16 years between his retirement from full-time farming at the traditional age of 60 and his retirement from teaching in 1975, he would publish more than half the entire output of his more than 50-year career. For moral, the record of Hearst's full poetic recovery is the excellent 1962 book, Limited View. The title poem epitomizes the virtues of Hearst's early style. Alike in subject and meter to his early poem, Fall Time, it shows a similar mastery of assonance, personification, and the memorable closing image. The clutter and rough of stubble publish the time that prompts my steps. I know what I have to do for my bread before frost locks the land against my hand and fire shoulders the chimney flue. But now I straddle the field and break its back in the vice of my plow. I gouge out furrows. A starved wind ransacks the sky. Yet Limited View is unmistakably Late Hearst. There is no apostrophe to autumn, but rather a quiet and intense statement of a lesson learned through experience. Rocks have a word that crows repeat over and over. On the cold slopes of winter where the pickings pour, it echoes in empty greeneries, and I learn by heart to say in the hard days to come, endure, endure. Change Toward Certainty is collected in Limited View, as are other poems that express Hearst's gratitude for love. Hearst would write many more such poems in the years to come. The domestic setting, with nature as symbolic backdrop, is most effective. The day sank under heavy wind, piling up drifts on the London street. Beneath my feet, the path toward home renewed itself, and fired with hope, I pushed my way into your arms. The ice-bound door closed on the dusk of a winter day. Then in your face, I saw the light, the deep June hour when nothing said among wild strawberries, searching hands touched and clung while the berries bled. This summer love melts winter fear, because your kiss has made it so, as if inside your window bloomed some great red flower against the snow. Hearst passed the age of 60 while writing the poems in Limited View. With the achievement of what many view as official old age, Hearst felt a new privilege to indulge himself. His love of a bad pun and his delight at the farcical way human behavior is reflected in the barnyard both emerge in the poem, Many Hens Do Not Make Light Work. The Drake has too many hens and he knows it. They squat meekly, suffocating vapors with sleepy eyes and soft necks. He bows loyally many times and shakes his tail up and down like a salt sifter to put himself in the mood. But alas, he treads the warm clean backs with every hope of achievement, but his promise wavers and he falls back, waddling off like a man late for a committee meeting. During these years, as one who thought deeply and had experienced a full and challenging life, Hearst found himself being sought out for his wisdom. He had never had much use for the conventional wisdom of others. As a man soweth, so shall he reap, had done little to justify the loss of his brother and wife. Now, in a poem that has been praised as, quote, a perfect summary of the one and only indigenous American philosophy pragmatism, unquote, Hearst lets fly a friendly blast at those who ask someone else for the wisdom they need in order to understand and live their own life. How the devil do I know if there are lots of yellow fields? How would you find out? If the plow strikes something harder than earth, the coin shatters at a sudden blow, and the tractor jerks sideways and dumps you off the seat because the spring hitches and set the trip quickly enough, and it never is. Probably you hit a rock. That means the glacier into this spot in Warfield is qualifying. But the connection with them is the only truth I know of, so plow it. At least one reader would find something of quietness and acceptance in limited view. These qualities were hard-earned and sometimes belie the emotional struggle felt by Hearst during the making of a given poem. Still, poems such as The Need for Grass reflect as much acceptance as Hearst would ever find, though he tries to distance these poems from the personal experiences that inspired them. Yes, there it was, the raw mound of a grave, hungry for grass. He had come up the hill under the dark trees, determined to be brave. He knew it was there, the center of his landscape everywhere. He knew there was a final closing to everything but pain. His love in earth's soft arms reposing would not come back again. There was no grass to grow over the scars these moments stenciled upon his heart. But in the last stanza, Hearst is not only experienced and implies that this is a third-person account of someone else. Alone, erect, with a brisk, nervous trot, he goes back to his car, like me or you, showing the world mostly what he is not, afraid to ever admit that he is afraid of being alone, alone, sad, and dismayed. It would take more than a single decade, no matter how much renewal it saw, to cover the last traces of a grave. So that's my reading from The Worth of the Heart. I will take questions now if there are any questions. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Scott. Congratulations.
Hi, Scott. I didn't see you there.
I'm embarrassed that you really, we didn't do this. You know, those of us that lived here and worked with him, I was a student as well. You should have done what you did. And congratulations for doing it and persevering to get it through to all of us. So I appreciate it. It's really a good book. Thank you.
Well, Scott, I want to thank you for sitting down and reading it.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
It was.
Thanks. Yes, Grace. My granddaughter, Grace.
I just want to say, I'm so proud of you.
Thank you, Grace. Any other questions? Jim?
I have a question, because though I know that you and I went back and forth a lot, and at the point where we were kind of looking, does this comma belong here or not? But in many ways, the manuscript that you originally wrote is the manuscript that's in the book now and it held up. But I'm wondering how it was for you to have to really come back and reread all of this very carefully after many years. What did you find changed or stayed the same for you?
So it's somewhat interesting, if you're a writer, because I wrote a couple of drafts of this before 1983, right? And then I actually went back a few years later and wrote a third draft where I drastically, in my own opinion, made some drastic improvements in what I'd actually done in the first two drafts. And then I felt it was pretty good, in the third draft that, sat in that box for all those years. So then when I came back to read it again while we were working on publishing it, those improvements I made in the third time around really held up. And then the only thing that was different was that I added some at the end. I extended the ending to go talking more about what happened after he passed. He bequeathed his home to the city and so on and so forth. So I added kind of an epitaph at the end, so to say. Yes.
I'm curious, you mentioned that you encountered Hearst when you were in Boston.
Yes,
here in New England.
Yes.
And lo and behold, this is a writer from your neck of the woods.
yes.
You come back and research, write about him. How do you position Hearst relative to other writers in the mid-20th century, maybe some of the New England writers that you
Yeah.
were probably reading in Boston?
What most impressed me about Hearst as a poet was actually the variety of styles that he mastered over the years. He had a very traditional style early on, very much harkening back to romantic poets, and then adopted a more modern style, a more free verse style later on in his career. So but none of his work was ever imitative or derivative from anyone else. I mean, you can say it shares some things in common with Robert Frost and Edgar Lee Masters and Carl Sandburg and William Carlos Williams. You could name, all the great American poets of the 20th century and say James Hearst had something in his writing that was in common with them, but it was always his own voice. And that is what was most impressive. I think, though in my book, I wanted to be fair, and I think there's a reason that he is not regarded as in the same conversation with Robert Frost, Carl Sandburg, and the rest, because at times he let the plainness of his subject and his language take away from what would be more evocative and more emotional or more a deeper meaning. So he did have his shortcomings, certainly, but I think he deserves more attention, especially on a regional or national level that he's had. That answer your question? Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, Scott.
Yeah, I think from what I heard today, I hadn't thought about this before, but Marilyn Monroe seemed to arrest it from obscurity completely.
Yeah.
She was kind of his muse.
Yeah.
Do you know how that worked? Did they just have a dynamic between them that she encouraged him? Or why did she become such a force?
Well, Merle was, I would say she was a level-headed individual.
Yeah.
Very level-headed, and Jim was very depressed about losing Carmelita, and I'm gonna move to Arizona and run a motel. I'm gonna do all those crazy things. And she said, just give yourself a chance to recover and put things in perspective. And she was always that kind of steadying influence. And she's very supportive too. She had a wonderful scrapbook about his, all the newspaper articles, whatnot about him that she shared with me when I was visiting them. Just a big, beautiful scrapbook. I think it's in his papers now. A big, beautiful scrapbook. She was so proud.
Yeah.
And, she would share this with me. So.
She seemed to have faith in his writing, probably
Yeah.
more than he did, actually.
Yes, at the time, yes. Yeah. He never quite felt that he made it as a writer, I don't think, in his own mind. And, he had all these wonderful publications in Poetry Magazine and leading journals and so much recognition from some influential poeters like Horace Gregory, the poet, thought a lot of his work, and Theodore Redke, the poet, thought a lot of Hearst's work and said some very good things. But he himself always lacked a bit of self-confidence, so she was able to give him that support. Yeah, she was an amazing person, very nice person. Yes.
So you interviewed James Hearst, like 10 times, and were you also a student?
No,
Oh, you were, okay.
no. I only knew him as his father.
Okay.
Right. So unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to study with him or anything like that. So.
Yeah, I was wondering what it was like for one of his classes was like, what it was like to have this.
I don't know firsthand. Now, I'll tell a story on my, I tell a story on my. All right, so my wife actually enrolled in one of his classes and came to the house here, and the classes were in the basement. And came to his house, and he made her so nervous because she said, I thought he was gonna fall out of his wheelchair. And honestly, my wife's a little bit hard of hearing, so she had trouble understanding when he spoke. But she ended up dropping out of the class.
I have no idea.
But what I heard from his students, people that had been his students, was that he was very, as I said in my book, a very considerate teacher. And I remember when I was talking about him with some of his poems and the meaning, and he would say repeatedly to me, he would say, whatever meaning you're getting out of it is fine. You know, there's no hidden meaning, there's no, special meaning. So the meaning you get out of it is what I intended. And, two people might read the same poem and get something different out of it. He said, that's perfectly fine. I have, that's great. And I'm sure that's how I conducted his classes too. Anything else? Any other questions?
Some of us did that for class.
Yes.
And it was across Elliott Yates seminar, graduate seminar across Elliott Yates.
Yeah.
Advanced, quite advanced, and he came really well prepared. I knew that he didn't have a formal education, but he knew more than most, even I was surprised at how much he brought to it. He always presented a short kind of introductory lecture and then a long discussion of each subject. So he was really an accomplished professional professor, even though he had no formal education.
And again, he always felt he somehow he always lacked self-confidence in his ability as a teacher too, just for that reason that he didn't have a finished an advanced degree, or any degree as far as I know.
He really overcompensated for that.
Yeah. Yes. So I'll tell one thing that just occurred to me. There's a lot of kind of funny or revealing things about James Hurst that I didn't include in the book. And one was speaking about the other great American poets. I think of Emily Dickinson, because he had written a poem. I forget what the rhyme was, but the rhyme was just, he pulled it out of thin air somehow to get this rhyme. And they said, how do you come up with this rhyme? And he said, I just think Emily Dickinson and plow ahead. And one day, one more memory of James Hurst being in the South. So, I did all these interviews, and I always wanted to dig a little deeper behind, statements he had published or, things he had said. He was on the radio quite a bit in his younger days and had kind of a few standard stories that he would tell and things. But I wanted to dig a little deeper, and I would say, well, let's dig a little deeper. What were you thinking when you wrote this poem? How did you feel at this time in your life, and so on? And he was very patient with me. But one day I was asking one of my probing questions, and he looked at me like this. He said, what are you going to do with all this? And I said, I don't know right now. But I eventually wrote a book.
Did you record those interviews?
I didn't.
No.
I did. I wish I had now, but I haven't. Anything else? All right, well, thank you so much for being here.